The October sky over Columbus, Ohio, hung gray and low the morning Harold Whitfield was laid to rest. The kind of gray that had no edges, the kind that pressed down on a man's shoulders and reminded him that the world kept turning even when his world had stopped. Eleanor Whitfield stood at the graveside in a black wool coat that had been hanging in her closet for 19 years, waiting for this day. She hadn't bought it for him. She had bought it for her mother back in 2001 and had never thrown it away because some coats remember things. The collar still smelled faintly of her mother's lavender water even after all this time. She had pressed her face into it that morning before leaving the house, and she had cried once quickly the way a woman cries when she does not have time for grief. 53 years of marriage. That was what she kept thinking. 53 years, and now there was a hole in the ground, and a man she had known longer than she had known anyone alive was about to be lowered into it. 300 people came. The funeral home parking lot had been full by 9 in the morning. Harold had been the kind of man who built things slowly. A small insurance agency in 1969 with 1 desk and 1 phone. By 1985, he had 4 employees. By 2000, he had a brick building on Elm Street, with his name in gold lettering on the front window. Half the small businesses in the county had bought their policies from Harold Whitfield. He had remembered their names. He had remembered their children's names. He had stopped at funerals and weddings and high school graduations, and people remembered that. Now they came to remember him. Eleanor stood beside the casket and shook every hand. Her feet ached in shoes she hadn't worn in 14 years. Her chest felt hollow the way a barn feels in February when the animals have been sold. But she stood. That was what you did. You stood, and you nodded, and you said thank you for coming, and you let strangers cry on your shoulder while you held your own tears in a place where nobody could find them. Her son Gregory worked the room. That was the word for it. He worked it. He was 47 years old, the age Harold had been when he opened the brick building on Elm Street, and Gregory wore a charcoal suit with a tie pin shaped like a small silver compass. He shook hands with both of his, and he leaned in close to listen, and he laughed at the right moments and grew solemn at the right moments, and not once during the entire morning did Eleanor see him touch the casket where his father lay. Diane stood near the flower arrangements with her husband, a thin man named Edmund, who managed a bank in Cleveland. Diane was 44, and she had her father's brown eyes and her mother's mouth, and she dabbed at her cheeks with a tissue that stayed perfectly dry. She wore pearls. She had borrowed them, Eleanor noticed, from her grandmother's jewelry box without asking. The pastor said all the right words. Harold had been a pillar. Harold had been a friend. Harold had loved his family. The casket was lowered. Eleanor watched her hand let go of a single white rose, and she watched the rose fall, and somewhere inside her something else fell with it. Then it was over. The reception was held at Gregory's house. Eleanor sat in a wing-back chair near the fireplace and let people come to her. She held a cup of coffee that grew cold in her hands. Beatrice, Gregory's wife, fluttered around the kitchen with a forced brightness, refilling platters, asking guests if they needed anything, making sure everyone could see how well she was managing the day. Beatrice was 43. She had married Gregory 18 years ago, and in those 18 years, Eleanor could count on one hand the times she had felt welcome in this house. By 4 in the afternoon, the guests were gone. Eleanor drove herself home. The house she had shared with Harold for 41 years felt enormous and silent. She walked from room to room without taking off her coat. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the chair where Harold had eaten breakfast every morning for 41 years. She did not sit in it. She did not touch it. She climbed the stairs and she lay down on her side of the bed, fully clothed with her shoes still on, and she stared at the ceiling. She did not cry that night. The crying came later. 2 weeks passed. Eleanor moved through them the way a woman moves through a long dream. She accepted casseroles from neighbors. She wrote thank you notes on cream-colored stationery. She ate when she remembered to eat, and she slept when sleep came, and she did not turn on the television, because Harold had loved the television, and the silence of it was the only thing that still felt like him. Then Gregory called. His voice on the phone was warm, too warm, the way a salesman's voice is warm. Mom, Diane, and we've been talking. We need to sit down together, just the three of us. There are some things we should figure out while everything's fresh. Saturday at 2 at my house. I'll have Beatrice make lunch. Eleanor said yes because saying no required a kind of energy she did not have. She drove herself to Gregory's house that Saturday. The driveway was wet from rain. She walked up the brick path with her purse held against her hip, the way her mother used to hold it, and she rang the doorbell, and Beatrice opened the door wearing a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than Eleanor had spent on clothes in the last decade. Eleanor, come in. The kids are upstairs. Greg's in the dining room. Not Mom. Eleanor. She walked through the hallway and she saw the dining room before they saw her. Gregory was at the head of the table. Diane was on his right with a leather folder open in front of her. There were papers, stacks of them. There were yellow legal pads. There were pens lined up neatly beside her hand. They had not just been talking, they had been preparing. Eleanor stopped in the doorway for a moment, and she felt something cold travel down her spine, and then she walked in and sat down across from her children, with her purse in her lap and her back perfectly straight. Gregory cleared his throat the way men clear their throats when they have rehearsed what comes next. Mom, thanks for coming. I know this is hard, and I want you to know we're only thinking about what's best for you. Eleanor said nothing. She had learned in 53 years of marriage that silence was a tool. Gregory glanced at Diane. Diane slid a document across the table. Mom, this is the deed to the house. Dad put my name on it 12 years ago, after his first heart episode. We discussed it then, you remember. It was practical, estate planning, so that if something happened to him, the house wouldn't get tied up in probate. Eleanor remembered. She remembered Harold sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow envelope telling her this was just paperwork, just a precaution, just in case. She had signed where he asked her to sign. She had not read the document. She had trusted her husband, and she had trusted her son, and she had signed. So, technically, Gregory said, and his voice did not break, did not falter, the house is mine. He let the words sit there. I'm not throwing you out, Mom. I want you to know that. But Beatrice and we've been thinking, and the kids are getting older, and we could use the space. And there's the property taxes, the maintenance, the lawn, the gutters. It's a lot for one woman alone. So Diane and we found a place, Sunrise Meadows. It's beautiful. They have activities, they have a dining room, they have nurses on call. Diane has the brochure. Diane slid a glossy brochure across the table. Eleanor did not pick it up. She did not look at it. She looked at her son, and she looked at her daughter, and she said very quietly, "And the bank accounts." Diane glanced down at her papers. Mom, we moved the funds into a trust, just for management purposes. Greg and I are the co-trustees. It protects the money from any complications. We can release funds for your living expenses, of course. You emptied the accounts. We secured the accounts. And the car. Gregory said, I was going to drive Diane's old one home. She and Edmund are taking the Cadillac. You don't drive much, Mom. We can arrange transportation for you. Sunrise has a shuttle service. Eleanor looked at her hands. 41 years she had driven that Cadillac. She had driven it to her mother's funeral and to her children's graduations and to the hospital the night Harold had his second heart attack. The car had 312,000 miles on it. She had cleaned every one of those miles by hand. And the agency, that was always going in my name, Mom. Dad and I worked that out a long time ago. Eleanor sat very still. She thought about how many casseroles she had made for Gregory's school events. She thought about how she had taught Diane to read. She thought about the late nights she had spent doing Harold's books in the early years of the agency when they could not yet afford a bookkeeper, when she had sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, balancing ledgers by hand because Harold had a meeting in the morning and his eyes were red from crying about money. She thought about 1,000 small kindnesses given freely, never measured, never asked back. And she thought about how in less than 90 minutes on a Saturday afternoon, her 2 children had divided the harvest of 53 years and left her with the husk. Is there anything left? She asked. Diane glanced at Gregory. Gregory cleared his throat again. There's the farm in Kentucky, Grandpa Walter's old place. Diane almost smiled when she said it. It's worthless, Mom. It's $11,000 in back taxes. The county sent letters years ago. The house is falling apart. There's no water, no electric. Nobody would buy it. Dad always said it was a money pit. Eleanor lifted her chin. I'll take it. Gregory blinked. Take what? The farm. My father left it to me. Not to your father. Not to a trust. To me. It's worthless, Mom. It's just a piece of paper representing a debt. Then you won't mind if I keep it. Neither of them argued. Why would they have argued? They had taken the house, the car, the money, the agency. They had taken everything that could be counted. The farm was a punchline. Eleanor stood up. She picked up her purse. She did not say goodbye. She walked down the hallway past Beatrice in the kitchen, past the framed photographs of grandchildren on the wall, and she walked out the front door, and she got into Diane's old Honda, which was now hers, until Diane decided otherwise, and she drove home through streets she had driven 1,000 times. She did not cry until she got into the bed she had shared with Harold, and then she cried until there was nothing left in her, and then she cried some more, and then she fell asleep with her shoes still on. The next morning Gregory called. He was very kind. He said it would be easier if she stayed at his house while the transition was being arranged. The Sunrise Meadows reservation was being processed. Just a few weeks. A guest room would be made up. Eleanor packed 1 suitcase. She walked through her own house, and she chose very carefully what she would take. A photograph of her mother. A photograph of her father standing in front of the barn in Kentucky. A small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother. Her father's pocket watch, which she had kept in her jewelry box for 22 years. A Bible that had her grandmother's handwriting in the front. A wool blanket. 3 dresses. 2 pairs of shoes. The clothes she was wearing. That was all. She left the rest. The wedding china. The good silver. The photograph albums of her children's birthdays. The recipe box. The ceramic rooster Harold had bought her on a trip to Williamsburg in 1978 because she had laughed at it in a gift shop. She left all of it for the children to fight over because she understood now that she had nothing they had not already taken. She drove to Gregory's house. She handed Beatrice the suitcase. Beatrice carried it up the stairs the way a hotel maid carries a bag with 2 fingers and a sigh. The guest room had a wallpaper border of pink roses. The bed was a double with a quilted bedspread that did not match the curtains. There was a nightstand with a lamp, and on the nightstand, when Eleanor walked in, there was a brochure for Sunrise Meadows. She set the brochure aside without opening it. She had been at the house for 4 days when she found the second brochure. She had been looking for an extra pillow in the linen closet on the second floor. Behind a stack of bath towels, there was a manila folder. Eleanor was not a woman who snooped. She had never read another person's mail in her life. But the folder was labeled in Beatrice's careful handwriting with 2 words, Sunrise Meadows. Eleanor opened it. Inside were brochures, application papers, a price list, a contract, a deposit receipt. The deposit receipt was for $2,500. It was made out to a corporate account at Sunrise Meadows of Columbus. The date on the receipt was June 14th. Eleanor stared at the date. Harold had not died on June 14th. Harold had died on October 7th. The deposit had been paid 4 months before her husband had taken his last breath. She stood in the linen closet with the receipt in her hand, and she did not move. She did not breathe. She felt for one strange moment like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff she had not known was there. Diane had reserved a room for her 4 months before her father died. They had been planning this, not after the funeral, before. While Harold was still drinking his coffee in the morning and reading the newspaper and asking Eleanor what she wanted for dinner, his children had been arranging the disposal of his widow. Eleanor put the receipt back in the folder. She put the folder back behind the towels. She closed the linen closet. She walked back to the guest room, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she stared at the wall. Something inside her that had been bending for 2 weeks finally broke. But she did not weep. She did not cry out. She did not call her son and her daughter into the room and confront them. That was not the way of Walter Brennan's daughter. She made a decision instead. For 3 weeks, Eleanor lived in that guest room. She ate what Beatrice put in front of her. She watched the grandchildren glance at her with embarrassed pity when they passed her in the hallway. She heard Beatrice on the phone with her sister complaining about how long this transition was taking. She heard Gregory in his study talking about the farm in Kentucky and laughing about how it would be a paperwork nightmare to even sell off the land. She listened. She watched. She said very little. And on the 22nd day, she packed the same suitcase she had brought, and she tucked her father's pocket watch into the inside pocket of her coat, and she walked downstairs at 5 in the morning before anyone was awake, and she left a note on the kitchen counter that said only, "Don't look for me, I am fine, Eleanor." She walked 4 blocks to the bus station with her suitcase bumping against her leg. She bought a one-way ticket on the Greyhound to Lexington, Kentucky, with a transfer to a small town called Dawson. The ticket cost $38. She had brought $110 in cash from the emergency fund she had kept hidden in a coffee can in the basement for 37 years, and she had spent $25 on a thermos and a sandwich at the gas station on the way to the bus station because she did not know when she would eat again. By the time she boarded the bus, she had $47 left to her name. The bus pulled out of Columbus at 7 in the morning. Eleanor sat by the window and she watched the city give way to highway, and the highway give way to fields, and the fields give way to hills. Ohio became Kentucky somewhere south of Cincinnati. The sky cleared as she traveled south, and by the time she crossed into the bluegrass country, the sun was high and the world looked washed clean. She did not sleep on the bus. She kept one hand on the pocket of her coat where the watch was, and she ran her thumb along the brass casing, and she felt the 4 small numbers her father had engraved on the back. She had carried this watch for 22 years. Walter had pressed it into her hand on her last visit to the farm when he was dying of emphysema and could barely speak, and he had held her hand with both of his, and he had said, "Keep this, Eleanor. You'll know when you need it." She had not known what he meant. She still did not know, but she was going home to find out. The bus dropped her at a gas station on the edge of Dawson at 3 in the afternoon. The town was 2 blocks of brick storefronts and a railroad track. Eleanor stood with her suitcase, and she breathed in air that smelled like cut hay and diesel and something sweet she could not name. A man at the gas pump looked her up and down. She asked him for directions to the old Brennan farm. Walters Place County Road 9 miles east. You family. His daughter. Hadn't realized Walter had kin. He kept to himself. She started walking. The road was narrow and shoulderless, and the suitcase grew heavier with every quarter mile. A pickup truck slowed beside her after the 2nd mile. The driver was a woman in her 60s with iron gray hair and a feed cap. "Need a lift, hon? I'm almost there." "Where's the Brennan farm?" The woman's eyebrows rose. "That place hasn't seen a soul in 20 years. "I know." The woman studied her face for a long moment, and then nodded once and drove on. Eleanor walked the last 2 miles. By the time she reached the gravel driveway of her father's farm, the sun was beginning to drop behind the tree line, and her shoes had blisters inside them, and her shoulder felt like it had been pulled from its socket. She set the suitcase down at the end of the driveway. She looked. It was worse than she remembered. The farmhouse stood at the end of the drive like something the world had forgotten about. The white paint had peeled down to bare gray wood on every wall. The porch sagged on the left side where the supports had rotted through. An upstairs window had been broken at some point, and a curtain hung half outside gray with weather. The driveway itself was choked with weeds and saplings that had pushed up through the gravel over 2 decades. Behind the house stood the barn. Once it had been red. Now it was the color of an old rifle gray and weathered and patient. The roof had partially collapsed at the south end. A heavy padlock hung on the main door, rusted but intact. Eleanor stood there for a long time. She was 70 years old. She had $47 in her pocket. She had no telephone. She had no car. She had no income. Her children had taken everything they could measure, and what they had left her with was this: a ruin, a debt, a piece of paper. She picked up her suitcase. She walked up the drive. The front door was unlocked. It had always been unlocked. Walter had never locked the house in his life. He had locked the barn, but never the house. Inside, the air was thick and motionless the way air gets when no one has breathed it in a long time. Dust covered everything. The living room had her father's recliner positioned by the window where he had always sat, and the leather had cracked in long fissures, and the cushion had been chewed by mice. The kitchen still had the blue flowered plates in the cabinets, the same plates she remembered from her childhood, the ones her mother had bought at a yard sale in 1953. She set her suitcase down in the front hallway. She walked the room slowly. She found the fuse box and flipped the main breaker. Nothing happened. She tried the kitchen faucet. The handle squealed and turned, but no water came. She went to her father's bedroom. The bed was still made. The quilt her mother had stitched before Eleanor was born lay folded at the foot. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the mattress, and the dust rose around her like a pale cloud, and she lowered her face into her hands, and she breathed. She did not cry. She had cried in Columbus. She had cried in Gregory's guest room. She had cried in the dark with her face in a pillow so that no one would hear her. She was finished with crying for a while. Crying was for women who had not yet decided what they were going to do. She had decided. She lifted her head. She looked around the room. The walls were her father's walls. The window was her father's window. Through it in the dying light she could see the dark shape of the barn against the orange sky. The barn that had been locked her entire childhood. The barn her father had never let her enter. The barn whose key in the form of a brass pocket watch she now carried in her coat. That night, Eleanor slept on the bare mattress covered by her grandmother's quilt. The mattress smelled of dust and old wool. The wind moved through the gaps in the upstairs window, and the house creaked and settled around her, and somewhere outside an owl called twice and went silent. She woke at dawn to the sound of birds, real birds, loud and close, not the muffled city birds of Columbus. She lay there for a long time, and she listened to them, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt something inside her chest that was not grief and was not anger. It felt almost like coming home. She got up. She found a broom in the kitchen pantry. She started sweeping. She worked for 3 days. She swept every floor in the house. She wiped every surface. She carried armloads of dead leaves and bird nests and chewed up paper out to the burn pile behind the barn. She pried open windows that had been swollen shut for 2 decades. She found an old coffee percolator in the back of a cabinet, and she scrubbed it with sand from the driveway because she had no soap. She found mason jars in the cellar. Tomatoes and green beans her father had put up before he died, sealed tight, still good after 22 years. She wept a little when she found them. Quietly, the way you weep when you find a letter in the handwriting of someone you have lost. On the morning of the 3rd day, she walked to the mailbox at the end of the drive. The box was rusted through on the bottom, but the door still opened. Inside there was a single envelope. It had no return address. It had no postage. Someone had simply walked up the driveway in the night and put it inside. Eleanor opened it standing there on the gravel. Inside was $300. 15 $20 bills folded once neat as fresh laundry. With the money on a small piece of lined paper was a note in shaky handwriting. Walter was a good neighbor. Welcome home. That was all. Eleanor stood at the end of her driveway and she held the money and the note in her hand. She looked up the road in both directions. The road was empty. There was no car, no figure, no sign of who had come. She did not know who had sent it. She did not understand it. Her father had been dead for 22 years, and someone in this corner of Kentucky still remembered him kindly enough to leave $300 in a stranger's mailbox for the daughter they had never met. She put the money in her coat pocket beside the watch. She walked back to the house, and for the first time since Harold had died, she felt very faintly that she was not alone in the world. She used the money to call the county from the gas station in town the next morning. She paid the deposits to have the water and electricity turned back on at the farm. She bought groceries at the small store inside the hardware store. Bread, eggs, flour, salt, coffee, a sack of potatoes, a small bag of beans. She walked the 4 miles back to the farm with 2 paper bags in her arms, and she did not stop to rest because she was Walter Brennan's daughter, and Walter Brennan's daughter did not stop on a country road. That afternoon she met Calvin Holloway. He pulled up the drive in a dented Ford pickup the color of dried mud. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with white hair cropped close to his skull and hands that looked like they had been used for honest work every day for 60 years. He was 72 years old. He climbed down out of the truck slowly, the way men climb down when their knees have stopped forgiving them. Eleanor came out onto the porch. She had a kitchen knife in the pocket of her apron, just in case. A woman alone learns these things. "Ma'am," he said, "my name's Calvin Holloway. I live 2 miles east past the bridge. I saw the smoke from your burn pile yesterday, wanted to make sure everything was all right." Eleanor studied him. He had pale blue eyes and a mouth that did not smile easily. He stood with his hands at his sides, neither friendly nor hostile, the way a man stands when he is letting another person decide the terms of the meeting. "I'm Eleanor Whitfield. Walter Brennan was my father." Calvin's eyes shifted slightly. Recognition. Something deeper than recognition. Walter's daughter. I'd heard he had one. Up in Ohio, was it? Columbus. Long way from Columbus to here. Yes, it is. He nodded slowly. He looked at the porch behind her, at the broken window upstairs, at the barn at the back of the property. "You staying?" "I'm staying." He nodded again. He did not ask why. That was the thing she would remember about him later. He did not ask why a 70-year-old woman had come alone to a falling-down farmhouse with no apparent means. He simply accepted that she had. "Your father and I were neighbors a long time. Used to sit on the bench outside the post office sometimes and watch the road. He was a quiet man, not one for speeches, but if a man's truck broke down within 10 miles of here, Walter was the first one out with a toolbox." That sounds like him. "You need anything, you come find me, or send word to the hardware store. June at the counter knows where I live." "Thank you, Mr. Holloway." Calvin's fine. He started to turn back toward his truck. Then he stopped. He looked at her over his shoulder, and for a moment something passed across his face. Something complicated. Something he was deciding whether to say. "Ma'am, your father wasn't a simple man. People around here, the few who remember him, they remember him kindly. But there's things about Walter Brennan that maybe you don't know. Things he never had the chance to tell you." "What kind of things?" Calvin looked at the barn. He looked back at her. He took a long breath. "Things that aren't mine to tell. But if you go looking, you may find them. And if you find them, don't be afraid. Walter was a good man. Whatever he did for reasons." He touched the brim of an invisible hat. He climbed back into his truck. He drove off down the gravel drive without another word. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the dust rise behind his taillights until it settled. That evening she ate beans and rice at the kitchen table by the light of a single bulb. The electricity had come on that afternoon. The water ran brown for 15 minutes and then cleared. The house was beginning slowly to feel like a house again. She sat at the table and she looked out the window at the barn. The padlock on the door was still rusted shut. She had not yet tried to open it. She had been telling herself that she was busy with the house, that the barn would come later. But she knew sitting there that it had not been busyness. It had been fear. Some small, frightened part of her was afraid of what was inside that barn. Afraid of what her father had hidden. Afraid that whatever Calvin Holloway had not been willing to tell her was waiting behind that locked door. She washed her dish in the sink. She dried her hands on a towel that had been hanging in the kitchen for 22 years. She walked out the back door. The sun had gone down. The sky was the deep blue of late twilight. The barn stood at the end of the path like a sleeping animal, and the rusted padlock hung in front of it, and Eleanor Whitfield walked across the yard with her grandmother's quilt around her shoulders and a kitchen flashlight in her hand, and she stood in front of the barn door, and she looked at the lock. She did not open it that night, but she walked the perimeter. She put her hand on the weathered wood. She felt for the first time the strangeness of a thing she had grown up beside but had never been allowed to enter. As a girl, she had pressed her ear to the gap in the siding once when she was 12, and she had heard nothing but the wind, and her father had caught her and raised his voice for the only time in her life. He had not hit her. He had not even scolded her, really. He had simply said, "Eleanor, not this, not ever this." And she had run from him crying, and she had never asked again. She stood there now, 58 years later, with her hand on the wood, and she said quietly into the silence, "Daddy, I'm here. I'm going to look. I hope you'll forgive me." The wind moved through the broken corn stalks at the back of the property. An owl called somewhere far off in the woods. The next morning she walked back to the barn with a claw hammer she had found in the kitchen drawer. She wedged the curved end behind the padlock hasp, and she pulled, and the rotted wood gave way, and the screws tore free, and the lock fell to the ground with a soft clatter. She pushed the door open. Light fell across the inside of the barn for the first time in 22 years. It was not what she had expected. Tools hung on the walls, rusted to the point of being sculptures rather than implements. Hay covered most of the floor, ancient and gray, packed down by decades of stillness. Collapsed beams from the partial roof failure lay in a tangle on the south side of the structure. A workbench sat against the back wall, its surface buried under debris. It looked like a barn, just a barn, a neglected, half-collapsed, ordinary barn. Eleanor stepped inside, carefully testing each footfall. The floor felt solid beneath her shoes. Solid. Too solid. She paused. She knelt down. She brushed away a patch of hay near the door. Underneath the hay was concrete. Smooth poured concrete, not the packed earth or wooden planks she would have expected in a barn floor, poured concrete like the foundation of a house, extending wall to wall as far as she could tell. Eleanor stood up slowly. She walked the length of the barn, kicking hay aside as she went. The concrete was consistent, no cracks, no seams, smooth professional pour. The kind of work a man hired a crew for. The kind of work that cost money. The kind of work no farmer in 1955 would have had any reason to do. In the northeast corner, she stopped. Something was different here. The concrete looked the same on the surface, but when she tapped the toe of her shoe against it, the sound was different. Higher, hollower, as if the concrete here was not poured against earth but laid over something else. She knelt. She knocked on the concrete with her knuckles. The sound that came back was deep, resonant, not the dull thud of solid concrete on packed earth, the echo of a closed space, of something hollow underneath. Eleanor sat back on her heels, and she did not move for a long time. Her father had poured a concrete floor in his barn, 6 inches thick by the sound of it. Smooth, professional, expensive work. He had done this in a county where most barns had dirt floors. He had done it in a year when he had no extra money, when her mother had been ill, when they had lived on potatoes and biscuits half the winter. He had poured this floor for one reason: to seal something underneath it, to bury something, to put it away in a place where no one would find it without first knowing it was there. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket. She took out the brass pocket watch. She turned it over in her hand. She ran her thumb across the 4 small numbers her father had engraved on the back 50 years before with the steady, patient hand of a man who had taken his time about everything important. She had carried these numbers for 22 years without knowing what they meant. Now she knew they were a key. She did not know yet what they would unlock, but she was going to find out. She closed her hand around the watch. She stood up. She walked out of the barn into the morning sun, and the wind moved through the dry grass. And somewhere beyond the tree line a crow called once, and Eleanor Whitfield, 70 years old, with $47 and 300 more from a stranger, and a pocket watch that her father had pressed into her hand on his deathbed, looked back at the barn one more time. She closed the door behind her. She had work to do. Eleanor walked into Dawson the next morning before the dew had burned off the grass. She wore a denim jacket she had found in the hall closet, one her father must have bought sometime in the 80s. The cuffs frayed soft from work she had never seen him do. The sleeves hung past her wrists. She rolled them twice. She did not have the kind of body that filled a man's jacket, but she did not need to. She needed pockets. She needed something to hold the shape of her shoulders against the wind. The walk took her almost 2 hours. Her hip ached by the time she reached the edge of town. She did not stop. Patterson's Hardware stood on the corner of Main and 2nd Street, a long brick building with a hand-painted sign and a screen door that slapped shut behind her when she entered. The bell above the frame rang once. The woman behind the counter looked up from a newspaper crossword. Reading glasses on a beaded chain. Hands that had folded 1,000 paper bags. Help you find something. A sledgehammer and a pry bar. The woman set down her pencil. She studied Eleanor for a moment. A small woman in a man's denim jacket asking for demolition tools. What are you taking apart? A floor. Concrete. Eleanor nodded. The woman pointed without expression toward the back of the store. Aisle 3. Take the 10-pound sledge, not the 16. You'll save your back. Eleanor walked the aisle slowly. She found the tools. The sledgehammer was $42. The pry bar was $18. She had $212 left from the envelope, plus what remained of the $47 she had brought from Ohio, and she needed every dollar of it to live on until something else happened. She was counting bills onto the counter when the bell above the door rang behind her. A man walked in, tall, straight-backed in the way of men who had spent their lives lifting their own weight, white hair cropped close, a canvas jacket worn soft at the elbows, boots caked with dried Kentucky clay. "Mornin', June," he said. "Morning, Calvin." He set a small box of wood screws on the counter beside Eleanor's tools. He glanced down at the sledgehammer. He glanced at her. He recognized her without surprise, the way a man recognizes a piece of land he has driven past every morning for 40 years. "That's a lot of sledgehammer for one person." "I'll manage." "Which barn?" Eleanor hesitated. She thought about lying. She was not in the habit of telling strangers her business. But she was tired, and Calvin Holloway had stood on her porch the day before without asking why, and that was a kind of currency she had forgotten the world still spent. "Mine," she said. "There's a concrete floor I need to break." His eyes moved to her hands. They were small hands. They had washed dishes and graded fifth-grade book reports and folded laundry for 50 years. They had not swung sledgehammers. "You're going to swing a 10-pound sledge at concrete by yourself." "I was planning on it." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at June behind the counter. June kept her eyes on the crossword, but the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "I've got a jackhammer in my shed," Calvin said. "Pneumatic, runs off a compressor. Save you a week of work and 3 herniated discs. I can't pay you. I didn't ask. Why would you help me?" He looked at her for a long moment. Pale blue eyes, not soft, not hard, steady. "Because Walter Brennan once pulled my father out of a snowbank in 1957, when my father had no business being out in that weather, and my father never forgot it, and I never forgot it. And because a woman your age swinging that hammer is a woman in the hospital by Tuesday." He picked up his box of screws. He walked to the counter. He paid for them in cash. "I'll be at your place at 7 tomorrow morning." "All right." He nodded once and left. The bell rang. The screen door slapped shut. June rang up Eleanor's tools without speaking. When she handed back the change, she said, "Calvin doesn't help just anyone." I gathered. Walter saved his father's life. Calvin paid that back for a long time after Walter passed. Mowed the field along the road for 15 years so it wouldn't go to seed. Never told a soul. Eleanor took her change. She put it in her pocket. She stood there for a moment with the bag of tools in one hand and the weight of $300 in an envelope, and a man mowing her father's field in silence for 15 years sitting somewhere in her chest. "Thank you," she said. She walked back to the farm with the sledgehammer banging against her thigh. Calvin Holloway pulled into the driveway at 6:45 the next morning. The pickup truck rattled with the weight of an air compressor strapped down in the bed, and a long yellow hose coiled beside it. Eleanor had coffee waiting. The percolator she had scrubbed with sand from the driveway worked just fine when she let it. She had bought ground coffee from the hardware store, and the smell of it filled the kitchen for the first time in 22 years. They drank it on the porch in silence. The morning was cool. The fields were silver with frost, where the sun had not yet reached them. Calvin sat on the top step, with his hands wrapped around the mug. Eleanor sat in her father's chair, which she had dragged out of the living room, and sat on the porch the night before, because the leather had grown brittle inside, and she had wanted it to feel the air again. "I helped your father fix this porch," Calvin said. 30 years ago. He did most of the work, just needed a man to hold the boards while he hammered. He built things. Always something, always a project. He never told me what. Calvin looked at her sideways. He did not answer. He set his mug down on the railing. He stood. "Let's go look at that floor." Inside the barn, Calvin walked the perimeter the way a man walks a stretch of land he is buying. He did not rush. He kicked at the hay. He tapped the concrete with the toe of his boot in 3 places. He knelt in the northeast corner where Eleanor had stood the morning before, and he pressed his palm flat to the cold, smooth surface, and he closed his eyes and listened. When he stood up, his jaw was tight. "There's something under here." "I know. This corner is different. The rest of the floor is solid pour, 8 inches at least, but here it's thinner, like he laid it over a cap. A hatch, maybe. A door." That's what I thought. He looked at her, pale blue eyes, steady and calm. "You want me to open it?" "Yes." He set up the compressor outside the barn door. He uncoiled the hose. He carried the jackhammer inside. He showed Eleanor where to stand far enough back behind a stack of hay bales he had pulled into a barricade. He handed her a pair of safety glasses and a bandana to tie over her nose and mouth. He put on his own. He pulled the trigger. The noise was a thing alive. It filled the barn. It rattled the rusted tools on the walls. It shook the loose siding. Eleanor stood behind the hay bales and watched chunks of concrete fly. Dust filled the air in a thick white cloud. Calvin worked with the steady patience of a man who had broken floors before. He drove the chisel point in straight lines. He peeled back layer after layer. He did not hurry. After 35 minutes, the chisel hit something different. A high metallic clang rang through the barn, sharp as a struck bell. Calvin let off the trigger. He killed the compressor outside with a foot pedal he had rigged. The silence that rushed in afterward felt enormous. He knelt. He brushed concrete dust away from the fresh hole with the side of his glove. Beneath the broken concrete, the dull gray surface of steel caught the light from the barn doorway. There it is. Eleanor stepped forward slowly. He worked for another 40 minutes, widening the hole, peeling back the cap of concrete that had hidden the hatch for 60 years. When he finished, the full outline was visible. A square steel plate, 4 feet by 4 feet, set into a steel frame that had been bolted directly into a poured concrete foundation beneath the barn floor. 1/4-inch plate by the look of it. The kind of steel a man used when he meant to keep something kept. A heavy combination lock hung from a recessed latch on the near side. Brass dulled by 60 years of stillness, but intact. Calvin sat back on his heels. He wiped his forehead with the cuff of his sleeve. He did not speak. Eleanor knelt beside the hatch. Her knees ached. She did not feel them. She reached into the pocket of her denim jacket and she took out her father's pocket watch. She turned it over in her palm. The 4 numbers caught the light from the doorway. They were small, and they had been carved with the same patient, steady hand that had labeled the bottles she did not yet know existed. 2, 7, 4, 1. She knelt over the lock. Her hands shook slightly. She had never been good at combination locks even in school. Her fingers had always fumbled the dial. But this morning, here alone in a barn in Kentucky, with the cold rising up through the concrete into her knees, her hands moved with a calm she did not know she possessed. Right to 2, past 0-1 full turn, then back to 7, right 1/2 turn to 4, left slowly to 1. The lock clicked. The shackle lifted free. Eleanor sat back on her heels. For a long moment she did not move. Calvin watched her. He did not speak. He gave her the space of the moment without crowding it. She reached out. She unhooked the lock. She set it carefully on the concrete beside her the way a person sets down something fragile. She put both hands on the hatch. Calvin moved beside her. He helped her lift. The hatch was heavy, and the hinges groaned with a deep rusted complaint of a thing that had not moved since Eisenhower had been in the White House. They lifted it together. It swung back on its hinges and stayed there, propped open by a steel rod that fell into place automatically when the hatch reached vertical. Cool air rose from the opening. It smelled of stone and of wood and of something else. Something faintly sweet. Something old. A smell Eleanor did not recognize, but that her body somewhere at the bottom of her memory recognized for her. A steel ladder descended into the dark. Eleanor took the flashlight Calvin handed her. She switched it on. The beam picked out rungs going down, and below the rungs, only blackness. "I'll go first," Calvin said. No. She did not say it loudly. She did not need to. This is my father's. Whatever's down there, he left it for me. I go first. He nodded once. He stepped back. She lowered her legs through the opening. Her foot found the top rung. She tested her weight. The ladder was bolted firmly to the wall. She climbed down rung by rung. She counted as she went. 8 rungs, about 10 feet. Her shoes touched a concrete floor. She turned the flashlight outward. The beam swept across the dark. She forgot to breathe. The vault was enormous. It stretched the full length and width of the barn above, a room dug deep into the Kentucky clay and lined floor to ceiling with poured concrete walls. The ceiling was reinforced with steel I-beams she could see in the flashlight beam. The air was cool and dry and absolutely still. Somewhere in the walls, faint and steady, she could hear the soft hum of a ventilation fan running off a power line she could not see, and filling the room. Row upon row, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, were wooden shelving units, hundreds of them, each shelf loaded with bottles, glass bottles sealed in red wax, each one bearing a small handwritten label. Thousands of bottles. Eleanor walked forward into the dark. Her flashlight moved across rows. She reached out. She lifted a bottle from the nearest shelf. The glass was thick and cold. The wax seal was unbroken. She turned the label toward the beam. The handwriting was her father's. Brennan Reserve, 1958, Barrel 7, Bottle 43. She held it up to the light. The liquid inside was the deep amber of old bourbon, perfectly clear, untouched. Calvin came down the ladder behind her. His flashlight joined hers. The 2 beams swept across the vault and could not find an end to it. The shelves marched away into the dark in every direction. "Good Lord," he said. Eleanor walked the rows slowly. She read the labels as she went. The bottles were organized by year: 1951, 1952, 1953. The dates climbed: 1955, 1958, 1962. The 1962 shelves were full but unfinished, as if production had stopped mid-year. After 1962, there were a few bottles dated 1965 and 1968, and then nothing. The shelves at the far end of the vault were empty, waiting for bottles that had never come. "How many?" Calvin said. She had been counting unconsciously as she walked. She finished the math. 5,000, maybe more. He let out a long, slow breath. "My father," she said. "My father was making whiskey." She set the bottle back on the shelf. She turned in a slow circle. She felt for one strange moment as if she were standing inside her father's hidden mind, as if every quiet hour he had spent in this barn over 40 years of her life had been laid out in front of her in glass and amber and wax. Near the foot of the ladder there was a workbench, cleaner than the rest of the room, untouched by the slow decay that had crept down the wooden shelves. Tools hung on a pegboard wall behind it, copper tubing in coils, glass beakers, hydrometers in a wooden rack, the careful, organized tools of a man who had taken his work seriously. In the center of the workbench, weighed down by a heavy, unlabeled bottle, was an envelope. Eleanor walked to it. The paper was yellowed, but intact. Her name was written on the front in her father's careful hand, the same script she had recognized her whole life on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the tag tied to the pocket watch he had pressed into her palm 22 years before. Eleanor. She picked up the envelope. The wax seal on the back was unbroken. She broke it with her thumbnail. Calvin stepped back. He turned off his flashlight. He moved to the far end of the vault and stood with his back to her, giving her what privacy a room buried in the earth could give. She unfolded the letter. Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have done what I hoped you would do, which is found this place. I owe you the truth about why I was never the father you deserved, and I will tell it to you now, and I will not hide behind softer words than the ones the truth requires. I started this in 1949. The war was over. I had come home to nothing. Your mother was carrying you. We were living in 2 rooms over a feed store in town, and the well at the farm had gone dry and the soil would not grow anything worth selling. I had 60 acres of clay, a wife with a baby coming, and a skill my own father had taught me back in the mountains when I was a boy. I knew how to make whiskey. It was illegal, of course. Federal crime, state crime, county crime. None of that mattered. I was 24 years old, and your mother needed a doctor, and you needed a roof over your head, and the only thing in this world I owned was a pair of hands and a recipe my father had passed down to me. So I built a still in the woods behind the property. I started cooking. Eleanor, I was good at it, better than I had any right to be. The whiskey I made was clean, smooth, aged right. Word got around. Men came from Louisville, from Lexington, from as far as Nashville to buy what I was producing. I charged a premium, and I got it. By 1953, I had enough money saved that I could build this vault. I poured the foundation myself. I hired a crew from out of state to do the concrete work, men who did not know where they were and did not ask. I dug the hole by hand, Eleanor. Every shovel of clay, every bucket of dirt. 2 years of nights after you had gone to sleep, after your mother had gone to bed with a single lantern alone in the dark beneath the barn floor. When it was finished, I had a room nobody knew about. Under a barn nobody cared about. On a farm nobody watched. I made whiskey for 18 years. Your mother knew. She helped with the bottling in the early days before her health failed. We aged everything in white oak barrels, bottled it when it was ready, sealed it in wax, stored it down here where the temperature never moves. I could have sold it all and lived rich. I never did. Because of what happened in 1962. Eleanor turned the page. The handwriting tightened. The strokes grew sharper, as if he had pressed the pen down harder. There was a man I trusted. He was my partner, my distributor, my friend, or so I believed. He got greedy. He wanted a bigger share. When I refused, he threatened to turn me in. When that did not work, he drove out to the farm one night with 2 men. You were 12 years old. Your mother had taken you to her sister's house in Lexington for the weekend. You did not see what happened. I will not write it for you. You do not need the details. But 3 men came to my farm that night with intentions I will not put on this paper. I had a Winchester .30-30 that had belonged to my own father. I used it. I did what a man does when his family is the thing being threatened. I buried the bodies in the ridge above the north pasture. I buried the truck the same week after I drove it 20 miles to a quarry I knew. I shut down the operation. I sealed the vault. I poured the cap of concrete you broke through to find this letter. And from that day on, for the rest of my life, I lived as if none of this had ever happened. I drove an old truck. I wore the same boots until they fell apart. I did not buy your mother the things she deserved. I did not give you the things I could have given you, because I knew Eleanor. I knew with the certainty of a man who has done what I did that any sudden display of money from this farm would draw the kind of eyes I could not afford. So I lived poor. I died poor. And I left this room sealed beneath the floor for one person. You. I left the farm to you in a trust drawn up in 1982 by an attorney in Dawson named Hollis Ward. His son took over the practice. The trust is irrevocable. It is in your name alone. Your husband cannot touch it. Your children cannot touch it. The government cannot touch it except for taxes I have paid forward as best I could. Everything in this vault, every bottle, every dollar's worth of it belongs to you and to no one else. I know I was not the father you wanted. I was distant. I was distracted. I spent my evenings in this barn when you needed me in the kitchen. I am sorry for that, Eleanor. I was building something for you, and I could not tell you what it was, and I have lived with the cost of that silence for the rest of my life. The whiskey is worth money, real money, more than the house I left you, more than anything you have ever owned. But promise me one thing. Do not let anyone take it from you, not ever. The people who love your money are never the people who love you. Trust the ones who came when you had nothing. Your father, Walter. Eleanor folded the letter slowly. Her hands were steady. The shaking had stopped somewhere on the second page, replaced by something quieter and harder. She looked up. Calvin was still standing at the far end of the vault with his back to her. She looked around the room. 5,000 bottles, give or take. 18 years of patient work in glass and oak and wax. A man who had spent 40 years living poor to keep a daughter safe from the consequences of one terrible night in 1962. She put the letter into her coat pocket beside the watch. Calvin. He turned. My father was not a farmer. He waited. He was a distiller. He spent his life hiding a fortune under this barn so that no one could take it from us. And the man who tried in 1962, my father killed him, killed all 3 of them, and buried them on the ridge above the north pasture. Calvin's expression did not change. He did not look surprised. He did not look horrified. He looked, Eleanor thought, like a man who had been carrying a stone in his pocket for a very long time and had just been allowed to set it down. I know, he said. Eleanor stared at him. What do you mean you know? I'll tell you, but not down here, up in the air, in the daylight. They closed the vault. They lowered the hatch back into place. Calvin went outside and brought back a sheet of plywood from the bed of his truck, and they laid it over the broken concrete and the steel hatch beneath it, and they covered it with hay until the floor of the barn looked more or less like a barn floor again. They sat on the porch in the cold afternoon sun. Calvin held a fresh cup of coffee. Eleanor wrapped her hands around her own cup and waited. My father was the sheriff of this county from 1958 until 1972, Calvin said. His name was Caleb Holloway. He served his country in the Pacific during the war. He came back, married, my mother ran for office and won. He was not a man who looked for trouble, but he was not a man who avoided it either. And he knew. Walter came to him in the spring of 1963, about 6 months after it happened. Your father walked into my dad's office and he closed the door and he sat down across the desk and he told my father exactly what he had done. My father listened. He let Walter finish. He did not write anything down. When Walter was done talking, my father got up, and he walked out of the office, and he drove down to the federal courthouse in Lexington, and he pulled the wanted poster file on 3 men who had been linked to a string of robberies and 2 killings in Tennessee. He brought the posters back. He laid them on his desk in front of Walter, and he said, "These are the men you described. They were federal fugitives. There were warrants on all 3 of them. If they came onto your property at night with bad intent, what you did was self-defense, and I am not going to pursue it." My father closed the file. He put it in his bottom drawer. He told Walter to never speak of it again to anyone. He told him to live quietly, and he never put it in the official record. He kept that file for the rest of his life. When he was dying in 1989, he gave it to me. He told me what was in it. He told me that one day, maybe Walter's daughter might come to this county, and if she did, and if she ever needed to know the truth, I should be the one to give it to her. Calvin reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. He pulled out a worn manila folder, brittle at the edges. He set it on the porch railing between them. "I have carried this for 31 years. Eleanor looked at the folder. She did not pick it up. Not yet. "Walter knew you knew. He suspected. We never spoke of it. That was the rule. And the $300 in my mailbox. That was me." She nodded slowly. She had known. She had not known how she had known, but she had known. Why? Because Walter saved my father's life in 1957, and my father owed him a debt that could not be paid in money. And after my father passed, I tried to pay it the only way I knew how. I mowed the road frontage. I kept an eye on the property. I waited. And when I saw smoke from your burn pile, I knew Walter's daughter had come, and I knew it was time to start paying what was left of the debt forward. Eleanor sat with that for a long moment. She watched the sun move across the gray boards of the barn. She thought about her father sitting in his office in 1963, telling a sheriff what he had done. She thought about the sheriff opening the bottom drawer of his desk and laying down a folder. She thought about the long, silent contract between 3 men, 2 of them dead, before she had ever known any of this had happened. "Calvin." "Yes." "Thank you." He nodded. He drank his coffee. She picked up the folder. The next 2 weeks moved fast. Eleanor wrote to a spirits appraiser in Louisville. Calvin made the introduction by phone through a man he knew who knew a man. The appraiser drove down on a Wednesday morning in a black Mercedes that looked out of place on the gravel driveway. He climbed down the ladder into the vault and stood at the bottom for 30 seconds without speaking. When he could speak again, his voice was thin. "This is real. It is real." He walked the shelves. He examined wax seals. He held bottles up to the lamp Eleanor had set on the workbench. He used a small flashlight to study the color of the liquid through the glass. He took notes on a clipboard. He did not speak for nearly an hour. When he was done, he sat down on the second chair Eleanor had brought down. He removed his glasses. He rubbed his face with the heel of his hand. "Who made this?" "My father." "Your father was a master. The aging, the storage conditions, the ceiling. I have been in this business for 30 years, ma'am, and I have not seen a private collection of this scale or this quality. Not in America, not anywhere." "How much?" He shook his head slowly. "Pre-authentication, pre-chemical analysis, pre-provenance, documentation. Just based on what I am seeing in this room, you are looking at $20 to $30 million. The number sat in the air. Eleanor did not react. She had expected something large. Hearing it spoken aloud was a different thing than imagining it, but she did not react because Walter Brennan's daughter did not gasp at numbers. How do I sell it? Slowly. A collection this size released all at once would crash the market. You sell in small batches, through private collectors, through select auction houses. With proper marketing, you could stretch this over 5 to 10 years, maximize the return. And if I needed cash quickly, he thought about it. I can connect you with 3 private collectors who would buy 100 bottles tomorrow. Pre-authentication. On my preliminary assessment alone, you would see somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 on the first batch. Set up the smaller sale, 40 bottles, the 1958 vintage. I want to see how it goes before I scale up. 40 bottles, you are looking at $160,000, roughly. Do it. He left that afternoon with 10 bottles for testing in the names of 3 buyers he said would pay. Eleanor walked him to his car. He shook her hand. His hand was damp. Mrs. Whitfield, I have to ask, how is it that no one knew? My father was a careful man. Yes, he said. Yes, I would say he was. The first sale closed 8 days later. $160,000 wired into a new bank account Eleanor had opened at the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Dawson. She paid the $11,000 in back taxes the day the funds cleared. She paid the next 5 years of property taxes after that. She bought a used Chevrolet pickup, 10 years old, sound engine rust, on the fenders, $3,200 cash. She hired a roofer to patch the upstairs of the house. She bought lumber paint hinges, glass plumbing fittings. Calvin came over 4 days a week, and they worked side by side on the property. He did not ask to be paid. She paid him anyway in cash in plain envelopes she left on the dashboard of his truck. He never mentioned them, and neither did she. The farm began slowly to look like a place where someone lived. Eleanor did not call her children. She did not call her son, and she did not call her daughter, and she did not write them letters, and she did not send word through anyone. For the first time in 50 years, she let her absence do the speaking for her. But silence carries. Diane was the first to notice. She tried Eleanor's old phone. The line had been disconnected. She called Gregory. Gregory had not heard from their mother in 5 weeks. They called Sunrise Meadows. Eleanor had never checked in. They called the police, who took a missing persons report and did exactly nothing with it because Eleanor was a competent adult and had left a note. Diane drove to Kentucky on a Saturday morning in late November. The rental car came up the gravel driveway just before noon. Eleanor saw it from the kitchen window. She set down her coffee. She walked out onto the porch and stood with her hands folded in front of her apron and waited. Diane got out of the car slowly. She wore a black wool coat that had cost more than the truck Eleanor was driving. Her heels sank into the gravel. She looked at the house, the fresh white paint, the new porch boards, the mended fence along the road. You painted it. Just the front. We're doing the sides next week. Who's we? A neighbor. Calvin Holloway. Diane climbed the porch steps. She stopped 2 feet from Eleanor. Mom, where did you get the money? I managed. You had $47 when you left Greg's house. I had a little more than that. The truck, the roof, the paint, the taxes. I checked the county records, Mom. $11,000 in back taxes paid in cash. Where did that come from? Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long moment. Diane was 44 years old. Eleanor had taught her to read at this age 50 years before. She had brushed her hair before church on Sunday mornings. She had put bandages on her knees when she fell off bicycles. She had stood in the audience at her high school graduation and cried when Diane walked across the stage. "Why did you come here, Diane?" "Because we were worried." "You were worried?" "Yes, you were worried that I was alive and well in a place you couldn't see." Diane's mouth tightened. She did not answer. "You can come in for coffee if you'd like, but you cannot come into this house and ask me questions you have not earned the right to ask." Diane stayed for an hour. She drank the coffee Eleanor poured. She made conversation about the grandchildren. She tried twice more to find out about the money, and twice more Eleanor said nothing. Diane's eyes drifted to the barn through the kitchen window. She did not go near it. Eleanor did not invite her to. When Diane left, she hugged Eleanor at the car. The hug was brief. Eleanor returned it lightly, the way one returns a hug from a stranger who has been polite at a funeral. She watched the rental car go back down the driveway. She stood on the porch until the dust had settled. She went inside and called Calvin from the kitchen phone she had finally had installed. "My daughter was here. She'll tell my son. He'll come next, but not in person." "What will he do?" "He's an insurance man, Calvin. He understands paperwork. He will look at paperwork. And he will find what he can find. And then he will come." She was right. Gregory moved fast. Within the week, he pulled property records from the county assessor's office. He found the trust drawn up in 1982. He found the paid tax receipts. He called the bank in Dawson and was politely told they could not discuss a customer's affairs. He called the law office above the post office and got the same answer. But Gregory was not a man who stopped at locked doors. He hired a private investigator, a man named Hollis Reed out of Lexington, who specialized in financial discovery and missing persons work. Gregory paid him a $5,000 retainer and gave him 3 weeks. Hollis Reed was thorough. He talked to neighbors. He talked to the woman at the hardware store who told him nothing. He talked to the mailman who told him nothing. He pulled records of the property. He walked the fence line. He was a careful man and a curious man, and on the second day of his second week while walking the ridge above the north pasture, he found a depression in the ground that did not look natural. He went back the next day with a metal detector. What the metal detector found was not a body. The bones were too deep. What it found in 3 places were small metal objects 6 to 10 feet underground in a configuration that any investigator would recognize. Belt buckles, a wristwatch, the trigger guard of a rifle that had been buried with whatever else had been buried there. He did not dig. He marked the locations with GPS coordinates. He photographed them. He drove to the courthouse in Lexington and pulled missing persons records for the years 1961 through 1964. He cross-referenced them against records of vehicles reported abandoned in nearby counties. By the end of the 3rd week, Hollis Reed had a file. He delivered it to Gregory in a sealed envelope at a hotel restaurant in downtown Columbus. Gregory drove to Kentucky the following Saturday. He arrived at 3 in the afternoon. He drove a black sedan up the gravel drive the way Diane had, but with none of his sister's hesitation. He parked 20 feet from the porch. He got out. He wore a wool overcoat and leather gloves and the same charcoal suit he had worn to his father's funeral. Eleanor met him on the porch. She did not invite him inside. "Mom," "Gregory, I want to talk." "Then talk." He looked at the house. He looked at the new paint. He looked at the truck in the drive. His jaw worked the way it had worked since he was a boy, when he was about to say something he had practiced. "Mom, I know about the whiskey." "Do you?" "I know you found something on this property. I don't know exactly what, but I know it's worth a lot of money. And I know how you found it. Grandpa Walter's pocket watch. The combination." He had been listening to Diane more carefully than Eleanor had thought. "All right. That's not all I know." He reached into his coat. He took out an envelope. He held it up between them. "I had a man on this property for 2 weeks. He found things, Mom. Things on the ridge above the north pasture. 3 depressions, a buckle, a trigger guard. He cross-referenced missing persons records from 1962. 3 men disappeared on the same night. Federal warrants out for all of them. Last seen in eastern Kentucky. The dates line up." He let the envelope sit in the air between them. "Grandpa killed 3 men, Mom. And I can prove it. I can give this file to the FBI tomorrow morning. I can tell them where to dig. They'll find the bones. The forensics will match. The case will reopen. And whatever this property is, whatever you found here, every dollar of it will be tied up in a federal investigation for the next 10 years. They will look at you. They will ask if you knew. They will ask if you've been profiting from a crime you concealed." Eleanor did not move. "What do you want?" "Half. Half of whatever this is worth. Half of the proceeds going forward, and I will make this file disappear. The investigator works for me. Nothing leaves his hands without my say-so." The wind moved across the porch. Eleanor looked at her son. She looked at the man she had carried inside her body for 9 months. The man whose first tooth she had pulled out under his pillow when he was 6. The man she had driven to baseball practice, to high school dances, to college on a Tuesday morning in August, with her car loaded down with a desk lamp and a comforter and a box of his favorite books. The man who had stood in his own dining room and told her she could keep the worthless farm. The man who had paid a private investigator to find a crime she had not committed in order to extort the woman who had given him life. "Gregory." "Yes, Mom." "Get off my porch." His face changed. He had expected anger. He had expected pleading. He had not expected the cold, flat finality of a woman who had finished negotiating decades before he had begun. "Mom, I'm trying to give you a way out. Once the FBI is involved, there is no controlling this." "I said, get off my porch." He stared at her. His jaw tightened. He took a step back, then another. He stopped at the top of the steps. "You have a week to think about it. 7 days. You will hear from me on Saturday. After that, the file goes to Lexington." He turned. He walked down the steps. He got into his car. He drove down the gravel drive without looking back. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the car until it disappeared past the bend in the road. Her hands were shaking. She did not let them shake for long. She closed them slowly into fists, and she opened them, and she closed them again, and the shaking stopped. She spoke quietly into the empty afternoon air. "Son, I buried my fear with my father a long time ago. You came here looking for a frightened old woman. You came to the wrong porch." She turned. She walked into the house. She closed the door behind her. Behind her, on the kitchen table where she had left it that morning, lay the manila folder Calvin had carried for 31 years. She picked it up. She held it against her chest. She walked to the phone. She lifted the receiver. She dialed Calvin's number. When he picked up, she said only one thing. "It started. Come over. Bring the file." She hung up. She sat down at the kitchen table. She looked out the window at the fields turning gold in the late afternoon light. She listened to her own breathing slow and steady. She was Walter Brennan's daughter. She was about to remind her son what that meant. Calvin's truck came up the driveway before the sun had finished setting. He carried the folder under his arm, the way a man carries a thing he has been entrusted with, neither hurrying nor lingering. He knocked once at the back door, and when Eleanor opened it, he stepped inside and set the folder on the kitchen table. She had laid out everything else, her father's letter unfolded, the pocket watch beside it, the notebook the appraiser had given her with his handwritten valuations, the bank statements, the deed and the trust documents the lawyer in town had given her copies of, a yellow legal pad with a pen on top of it. She had been a schoolteacher for 35 years. She knew how to organize a defense. Calvin sat down. He did not ask what Gregory had said. He waited. He hired a man, Eleanor said, an investigator. He spent 2 weeks on this property without my knowing. He found the ridge above the north pasture. He found enough to match the missing persons records. He didn't dig. He marked it on a map. He gave the file to my son. Gregory wants half of whatever the whiskey is worth. He gave me a week. After that, he says he goes to the FBI. Calvin listened with his hands flat on the table. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He's playing a weak hand," Calvin said. "I know. He has no body. He has metal in the ground. He has a circumstantial timeline. He doesn't have the wanted posters. He doesn't have the sheriff's notes. He doesn't have the witness who can tell the FBI those men were federal fugitives with warrants out for murder. I know. He thinks he has leverage because he knows you're afraid of the noise, the investigation, the reporters at the end of the driveway. He thinks you'll pay to keep it quiet. He's not wrong about the noise. He's wrong about me." Calvin nodded slowly. He looked at the folder on the table. "What do you want to do?" Eleanor sat down across from him. She folded her hands. "I want to do it before he does it. I want to walk into a federal office on Monday morning with the wanted posters, the sheriff's notes, your father's name on the file, and the trust paperwork. I want to put it on a federal agent's desk myself. I want the story told my way before my son gets the chance to tell it his. That takes a lawyer." "Yes, it does. You have one in town. He's a good man. But for this, you may need bigger. I'll start with him in the morning. He'll know who to call." Calvin nodded. He looked at her over the table. "Eleanor." "Yes. You sure?" "I have been waiting 50 years to be sure of something. I am sure of this." He left a little after 9. Eleanor sat at the table for another hour, reading the folder Calvin had carried for 31 years. The wanted posters were photocopies, but they were clear. 3 men. 2 homicides in Tennessee, 1960. A bank robbery in eastern Kentucky, 1961. The 3rd man had been wanted in connection with the death of a woman in Nashville the same year. Sheriff Caleb Holloway had circled their photographs with a soft pencil and noted in the margin in his own steady hand, "Match. Identification confirmed by federal teletype March 14th, 1963. The sheriff's report was 3 pages, typewritten, dated March 19th, 1963. It described in the careful, neutral language of a lawman an interview with one Walter Brennan, who had presented himself voluntarily to disclose an event from October of the previous year. The report concluded with a single sentence at the bottom of the 3rd page. "Determination. Self-defense. No charges to be filed. File to remain sealed in private records of the office of the sheriff, by order of Sheriff Caleb Holloway. Eleanor closed the folder. She placed her father's letter on top of it. She placed the pocket watch on top of the letter. She went to bed. She did not sleep until almost 3 in the morning. When she did, she dreamed of her father at the kitchen table in this house, 50 years younger, looking at her across his coffee cup the way he had looked at her once when she was 12 and had asked him a question he had not been able to answer. In the dream, he opened his mouth to speak. She woke before she heard what he said. The lawyer's office above the post office in Dawson opened at 8. Eleanor was there at 7:50. She carried a brown accordion folder she had bought from the office supply rack at Patterson's Hardware. She had packed it the night before. Everything was inside. The lawyer's name was Henry Ward. He was the son of the Hollis Ward, who had drawn up Walter's Trust in 1982, and he was a man in his middle 50s with a desk piled high with folders and a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Lawyer" in faded letters. She told him everything. She told him about the vault. She told him about the letter. She told him about the bottles and the appraiser and the first sale. She told him about Gregory's visit, and about Hollis Reed and the ridge above the north pasture, and about the deadline. She told him about Calvin's father and the folder Calvin had carried for 31 years. She set the folder on his desk, and she set Walter's letter on top of it, and she sat back in the chair and waited for him to speak. Henry Ward did not speak for a long time. He picked up the folder. He read it through slowly. He read the wanted posters. He read his predecessor sheriff's report. He turned each page with the care of a man handling old paper. He set it down. He picked up Walter's letter. He read that too. When he was finished, he leaned back in his chair. He took off his reading glasses. He set them on the desk. "Mrs. Whitfield, yes, in 30 years of practice, I have not seen a file like this. I imagine not. Your father killed 3 men. 3 men who were federal fugitives on warrants for homicide and armed robbery who came onto his property at night with the intention of harming his family. By the laws of the Commonwealth of Kentucky in 1962, and by the laws of the Commonwealth of Kentucky today, what your father did was self-defense. The fact that he did not report it does not retroactively make it a crime. The disposal of the bodies is technically a misdemeanor at this remove, and the statute of limitations on that misdemeanor expired in approximately 1964. So he can't be prosecuted. He's also been dead for 22 years. So no, he cannot. And me. You knew nothing until a few weeks ago. The trust precedes your knowledge of the events by decades. There is no theory under which you are an accessory to anything. And the property. The property is yours, free and clear. The trust is irrevocable. Your son has no claim to any of it. Not the land, not the contents of the vault, not the proceeds from any sale past, present, or future. Eleanor exhaled slowly. She had known these things. Hearing them said by a lawyer in a chair across from her settled them inside her chest in a way that knowing them alone had not. What do you recommend? I recommend that we get out in front of this. Today. We do not wait for your son's deadline. We do not let him control the narrative. I have a contact at the United States Attorney's Office in Lexington. Her name is Margaret Sullivan. She is a thoughtful prosecutor. I will call her this morning. We will make a statement voluntary on the record at her office with this file in front of her. We will lay it all out exactly as it happened in the proper sequence. By the time your son walks in with his investigator's report, the case will already be closed. Today, I will drive you myself. Eleanor reached across the desk. She put her hand on Henry Ward's hand. He looked startled for a moment. "Thank you." He cleared his throat. "Your father trusted my father, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm honored to do this for you." They drove to Lexington that afternoon. Margaret Sullivan was a small, sharp-eyed woman in a navy suit who listened for 2.5 hours without interrupting. She read the folder. She read Walter's letter. She made a phone call from her office to a colleague in the records section and confirmed by computer that the 3 men whose names were on the wanted posters had remained on the federal fugitive list until 1989, when they had been administratively closed for lack of activity. They had never been found. No families had ever been notified. No one had ever gone looking. When she was finished, Margaret Sullivan put both hands flat on her desk. "Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Ward, I will need to confer with my supervisor, but my preliminary determination is that this matter is closed. There is no live federal interest in this. The men were dangerous fugitives. Your father acted in defense of his family. The 1963 sheriff's investigation was lawful, and the determination was lawful. The bodies on the property, when located, will be handled as cold cases. Identifications will be made if possible. I will personally contact the appropriate state agencies in Tennessee and Kentucky, and they will decide whether to pursue further investigation, but I do not anticipate any. The case files on those men are closed. The witnesses are dead. Nobody has been looking for these 3 for 35 years. And if my son brings the same information to the FBI on Saturday—" Margaret Sullivan smiled very slightly for the first time. "Then he will be told courteously that the United States Attorney for this district is already in possession of the case file, that the determination has already been made, and that his information adds nothing. He will go home. The attempt may be noted in his file." Noted. As an attempt by a private citizen to use a federal investigation to extort his elderly mother. We see this more often than you would think. We do not always do anything about it, but we note it. Eleanor nodded. She did not smile. She did not feel triumph. She felt the calm of a woman closing a door that had been blowing open for a very long time. They drove back to Dawson in the dark. The next 4 days passed quietly. Eleanor went about her work. The roofer finished the porch. Calvin came over and they hung 2 new shutters on the front of the house. She drove to the grocery store in town. She wrote letters to 2 more collectors the appraiser had connected her with. She did not call Gregory. She did not call Diane. On Saturday morning, Gregory came back. This time he brought a lawyer. The black sedan came up the drive at 9. 2 men got out. Gregory in the same charcoal suit. Beside him, a younger man in a dark overcoat carrying a leather briefcase. The lawyer's hair was slick. His tie was pinned with a small gold bar. Eleanor met them on the porch. She did not invite them in. "Mom," Gregory said, "this is Daniel Carmichael, my attorney." "Mr. Carmichael." "Mrs. Whitfield, we're here to discuss a settlement that will avoid considerable difficulty for everyone involved. I think you understand the gravity of the situation. My client has provided me with a file regarding the property on which we are now standing. We believe a sensible discussion is preferable to the alternative." Eleanor looked at him. She had spent her career standing in front of 7th graders. Lawyers in dark coats did not impress her. "Come in." She opened the door. She led them through the house to the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had read her father's letter for the first time, the same kitchen where she had laid out her papers 4 nights before. She had cleared the table. On its bare wood, she had placed 3 things in a neat row: the folder of wanted posters, the 1963 Sheriff's Report. A letter on United States Department of Justice letterhead, signed by Margaret Sullivan 2 days earlier, confirming in formal language that the matter of the disappearance of 3 named federal fugitives in 1962 had been reviewed by the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Kentucky, that the actions of one Walter Brennan had been determined to be self-defense, that no charges were pending, and none would be brought, and that the file was now closed. Daniel Carmichael saw them as he sat down. Eleanor watched his face. She watched the lawyer's eyes move down the row item by item. She watched him understand. He understood faster than Gregory did. Lawyers always did. He cleared his throat. He looked at Gregory. "Greg, I think we should step outside." "What?" "No. I want to hear what she has to say." "Greg." "Daniel, sit down." Eleanor said very quietly, "Sit down, Gregory. Both of you. I have things to say." They sat. Eleanor remained standing. She placed her hands on the back of a chair. "Gregory, you came onto my property a week ago and you tried to extort me. You used the memory of my father, a man who lived poor for 40 years, to keep you safe as a tool to threaten me. You hired a man to walk on land that does not belong to you. You took his report and you put it in your pocket, and you came here and you put it on the railing of my porch, and you offered me the great kindness of half my own inheritance in exchange for your silence." Gregory opened his mouth. "You will not interrupt me." He closed it. "Yesterday morning, my attorney and I drove to Lexington. We met with the United States Attorney for this district. We laid the entire matter on her desk, the wanted posters, the sheriff's report from 1963, my father's letter, the trust documents, everything. The case is closed. It was closed yesterday afternoon by formal letter signed by a federal prosecutor whose name and number are at the top of the document in front of you. Read it." Carmichael read it. His face did not change. It did not need to. He had read it the moment it had hit his eyes. "Greg," he said quietly, "we need to leave. Now." "No, Mom, you can't just—" "I have done it. The file Mr. Reed put in your hand is worthless. The leverage you thought you had does not exist. It never existed. It was never yours to use. It was always mine." Gregory's face had gone the color of old paper. "Now you will hear the rest." She walked around the table. She stood in front of her son. She did not raise her voice. "You came to this kitchen as a stranger pretending to be my child. I want you to leave it as a stranger and stop pretending. I have informed my attorney that I am amending the trust to remove you by name from any future inheritance, from any role in any decision regarding any asset I now own or may come to own, from any contact with my person except in writing and only through my attorney. As of today, Gregory, you are not in my will. You are not in my care. You are not in my life." Gregory's hands were shaking on the table. "Mom, you can't do this." "It is done. You forgot one thing, Gregory. You forgot whose daughter I am." She stood in front of him, 70 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 130 pounds, with nothing in her face but the long, quiet weight of every decision he had ever made about her. "I am Walter Brennan's daughter. Get out of my house." Carmichael was already standing. He had his briefcase under one arm. He took Gregory by the elbow. "Greg, we're going." Gregory rose. He did not look at his mother. He turned and walked toward the front door. Carmichael followed. The door closed. The black sedan started in the drive. Eleanor heard the gravel under the tires as it pulled away. She did not move from the kitchen for a long time. When Calvin came over that evening, she told him what had happened. She told him in plain words and short sentences. He listened in his usual way. When she was finished, he said, "Eleanor, you did right." "I know. How do you feel?" She thought about it. Empty and clean, like a barn after the harvest. He nodded. "That'll do." The petition arrived 2 weeks later. Eleanor was not surprised. Gregory was a man who, when one weapon was taken from him, reached for another. This one was conservatorship. A petition filed in the county court of Franklin County, Ohio, where Eleanor's last legal residence had been, but that the county clerk informed Henry Ward by phone could be transferred to Kentucky on motion. The petition asserted in the careful, incompetent prose of a hurried filing that Eleanor Whitfield was an elderly widow in mental decline, suffering from grief and confusion, residing in unsafe conditions on a remote rural property, and being financially exploited by an unknown male party, identified in the filing only as a Mr. Holloway of Kentucky. Calvin laughed when she read him the relevant paragraph over the phone. "He named me. He named you. He called you a male party and said you were exploiting me for whiskey money. At my age, exploiting a widow." Calvin's laugh was dry as a corn husk. "That's the nicest thing anyone said about me in 20 years. Calvin, yes, you are going to have to come to court. I figured, don't worry, I'll wear a tie." The hearing was set for the second week of January. Eleanor used the time the way she used everything. She prepared. She drove to Columbus on a Tuesday and saw her doctor, the same doctor who had treated her for 15 years. The doctor, a woman named Marjorie Olson, ran the cognitive assessment in the office that morning, and at the end of 2 hours she sat back and shook her head. "Eleanor, you are sharper than I am." "Marjorie, I will write whatever you need." The letter, when it came, was 3 pages on the doctor's letterhead. It described in clinical language a cognitive assessment that placed Eleanor in the top 5% of her age cohort. It described a mental status examination that found no impairment of any kind. It described the doctor's professional opinion, formed over 15 years of continuous care, that Mrs. Whitfield was not only competent to manage her own affairs, but was, in the doctor's words, demonstrably more competent than the average person half her age. Henry Ward read the letter and smiled for the first time that Eleanor had ever seen. "Mrs. Whitfield, we are going to enjoy this hearing." The morning of the hearing, she dressed carefully. She wore the gray wool dress she had bought in town. She pinned her father's pocket watch to the lapel of her coat. She drove herself to the courthouse in her Chevrolet pickup. Calvin met her on the steps. He had in fact worn a tie, navy blue. It was the only tie she had ever seen him in. Henry Ward met them in the hallway with a banker's box. "Everything is in here," he said. "Every receipt, every tax payment, every bank statement, every appraisal, every contract, every dollar accounted for, plus the doctor's letter, plus the trust, plus the federal letter from Margaret Sullivan." "Why the federal letter?" "Because if your son's lawyer is foolish enough to bring up the property in any way, I want to be ready." The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, fluorescent lights buzzing. Gregory and Daniel Carmichael sat at the table on the left side. Diane sat behind them in the gallery alone. Her husband had not come. Her face was pale and her eyes were red, and she did not look up when Eleanor entered the room. Eleanor noticed that. She filed it away. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Hollander, silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, the kind of judge who read every paper before she sat down. She read the petition for nearly 15 minutes in silence while the two lawyers waited. When she was finished, she looked up. "Mr. Carmichael, you filed this petition." "Yes, Your Honor." "You allege mental incapacity." "That is the basis of the petition, Your Honor." "What is your medical evidence?" A long pause. "At this time, Your Honor, we do not have a formal medical evaluation. The petition is based on the observed conduct of the respondent who—" "Stop. Let me ask you again. What is your medical evidence?" "We have none at this time, Your Honor. We had hoped that the court would order an evaluation." The judge looked at him over her glasses. "Mr. Carmichael, you filed a petition to strip a 70-year-old woman of her right to manage her own affairs without one piece of medical evidence, without a treating physician's statement, without a psychiatric report, without anything. Your Honor, our client believes—" "Sit down, Mr. Carmichael." He sat. Henry Ward stood. He opened the banker's box. He began. He laid the doctor's letter on the table. He laid the trust documents. He laid the bank statements showing every deposit, every withdrawal, every balance. He laid the receipts for the property tax payments. He laid the contract for the truck. He laid the receipts from the roofer. He laid the contracts from the whiskey sales redacted for privacy, but showing dates and amounts. He laid the appraiser's report. He laid the letter from Margaret Sullivan at the United States Attorney's Office. He spoke for 12 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked the judge item by item through the timeline of Eleanor Whitfield's last several months. The arrival in Kentucky with $47, the repair of the property, the discovery of inherited assets on the trust property, the lawful sale of those assets, the payment of taxes, the opening of bank accounts, the maintenance of every record in proper order, the federal review of the entire matter and its determination that no charge